Welcome to Rappahannock Issues. I'm Tom Cohen,
And I'm David Kerr.
and we're going to be looking at topics that are of interest to our community, both regionally and to the state.
Hello and welcome back to Rappahannock Issues. We're here this week talking about the presidency, and specifically great presidents, favorite presidents, most underrated presidents. I'm here with Tom Cohen, my co-host, and Dr. Stephen Farnsworth from the University of Mary Washington. We just talked about persons we identify as amongst the best presidents. We want to talk about our favorite presidents. Not always the best, though maybe the best. Dr. Farnsworth, do you have a favorite?
Well, in addition to the best presidents, who are really worth the attention that we've devoted to them so far in the program, I think it's important to draw out Harry Truman as a favorite president. I think one of the things that you really saw with Truman was somebody who really did not necessarily have all the advantages that some of the other presidents had. You know, FDR had extraordinary education, he had extraordinary connections, his family was one of the most influential in the country. Truman's family, they were farmers. They did not have the money for him to go to college, and so he was largely self-taught. And what I think really makes Truman an appealing president to think about in this context is the extent to which he appreciated his own limitations. And he hired people who were very talented, very effective, and that was part of it. But he also had very sound judgment himself, a certain toughness that is really, I think, lacking sometimes in American presidents. If you think about modern presidents and how they try to follow the polls and how they try to do what is expedient politically, Truman was somebody who said, this is just plain wrong. MacArthur needs to answer to the commander-in-chief. He won't. He's done. You know, the armed forces. People fought to get rid of racism in Germany. Well, maybe there should be the end of racism in the U.S. military, and he desegregated the military. And so when you look at those kinds of unpopular decisions and the sound judgment behind them, you know, I think you can really look at Truman as somebody who is really in the top ranks as well.
And sort of piggyback on that, it's I think mine and yours, the biggest thing about them is they wouldn't have brought people into the White House to see how could they be up in the great presidents. It's sort of they're more interested in how do you govern effectively than how am I going to be looked in the history books. And I think that's a really big difference between some of the presidents, especially the more recent ones. I have three that are my favorites, and I view favorite as if somebody comes out with a book, I want to pick it up and read it. Bush 41, George Herbert Walker Bush, partly because of just the diversity in his background and what he did as president. McKinley, who really, in my mind, created the modern presidency. Teddy gets all the publicity. But McKinley's fascinating, particularly his early life. And then Coolidge, who I know most textbooks will give a caricature of him, but there's a lot more there as governor and as president than most people give him credit for.
If I were to look at my favorite president, Dr. Farnsworth and I wouldn't be too far apart. It's Harry Truman. I was just thinking about it when you mentioned his education, Doctor. He's just about the only president who didn't have a college degree in the 20th century. And you're talking about his no-nonsense approach to carrying out his policies, specifically on the desegregation of the armed forces in 1947, I think it was. It was an executive order. It was not popular in the Senate. It wasn't popular in the House. And his own Secretary of the Army, who was a critical factor for his running for re-election in 48, he needed North Carolina, which he carried, by the way, anyway. But it was a fellow named Kenneth Royal, who was the Secretary of the Army. And he didn't implement the desegregation order fast enough. Didn't want to do it at all. He was a been in World War I, didn't care for the whole idea. And here we're getting close to the 48 election, and Truman fires him very publicly. It was not as well publicized as MacArthur, but it was the kind of thing that he would do. If you're in my administration and I give an order, you're going to have to do it. And the political consequences were arguably at that point severe. I just like that whole approach. And I remember an interview with Clark Clifford where he was asked what he liked best about working for Truman. And he said, well, it was his incredible ability to grow. He said he went in kind of overwhelmed by the office in many respects, and rapidly understanding the European situation, he came up to speed very quickly, saw a much broader picture, emerging Cold War, the need, specifically for the Marshall Plan, and that was actually poles apart from where he started the very first day he became president. There's that wonderful ability to develop his personality and to not be fixated.
We also wanted to look at overrated presidents. So I'll sort of start with this one. The presidents that either the history books, government books, or the media tend to just laud massively. I start with John F. Kennedy. I agree with the idea of the new aura, the new generation, and the handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis were great. But other than that,
and we're all still here because of that.
Right, but there's not much more there. And then there's always this myth that's built up that if he had lived, all these things wouldn't have happened that were bad. I think Wilson is terribly overrated. The racism and the bigotry policies, some of his policies, and then the whole Treaty of Versailles debacle, which many historians have said and are coming around to the viewpoint, really led to World War II in many ways. Jackson, I think, is terribly overrated. Violated the Constitution. Some of his policies were just really, really detrimental. And then probably a sacrilege in this country, Jefferson. I don't think Jefferson
can't believe you said
deserves-
that in Virginia.
Yeah, I know. In Virginia, I'll be vilified, but I think, again, there's just a lot. They give him praise for the Declaration, but then there's not much else. And we have about 2.5 minutes left. So.
Well, it's my recommendation for the most overrated president is actually Ronald Reagan. I think that with Reagan, there were a lot of scandals, and he was a very poor manager of people. The Iran-Contra affair was only the last in a whole series of poor administrative judgments that he made. I think Ronald Reagan's skill was in connecting with the public. He was a very effective communicator. But if you look at more the policy aspects of what he accomplished, you really do see a number of issues where things really fell short. I think when you look at the situation in Afghanistan during his presidency, that was a problem. When you think about the commitment to a balanced budget and the huge deficits that followed, that's another problem. Ronald Reagan was by no means a bad president. I would put him down at the average category. But the idea that Ronald Reagan was an exceptional president, a first-rate president, I think is really an overselling of what was a pretty mixed legacy.
I have less than a minute left, David, for yours. Sorry.
Well, that's all right, because I have one. I don't disagree with Dr. Farnsworth about Ronald Reagan. When I was growing up, I was a big fan of Woodrow Wilson. I read a lot of books about him, really enjoyed it. And then I started learning more about his rather intense racism. Big fan of The Birth of a Nation, and invited the entire Supreme Court to come over and watch the movie. Really kind of creepy. And yes, the Treaty of Versailles is just a little rewrite of the history on that point. So definitely overrated. Lots of good progressive legislation, but I'm not warm to the figure. I don't think he'll do so well no longer.
And we are about to go to break, so in the long term, we'd like you to come back from break and see us. We'll be talking about the ones that we think are underrated presidents, and then maybe get into the worst. So the worst thing you could do is not to come back after the break.